Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and we're going to talk about Chapter 9. Before we do that, one of the things to think about as you read this chapter, and actually I would argue as you read all the chapters in this book, is this notion of the more things change, the more they stay the same, because all the stuff that's going on in politics today, name calling, tweeting, stuff with communications, this idea that the country is degraded or the presidency is degraded, it was all going on back in the 1790s leading up to the 1800s as well. So really nothing new. And really, so in Chapter 8, when we left Chapter 8, John Adams was in office, and there was the Alien and Sedition Acts and this idea that freedom of speech had come under attack. And as we get into Chapter 9, now Jefferson is becoming president in 1801 and really talking about the same things that we talk about today, trying to bring the two political parties together. And for a time, the parties were together, or at least as close as they were going to be for a little while, and it was still the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson comes into office, but even that election is contested. There was a tie between Jefferson and Adams was running again, and the election had to be decided in the House of Representatives. So, right before Adams leaves, it's the same old stuff. The Federalists under Adams are trying to load the courts with Federalist judges. They're also trying sort of a court packing scheme, if you will. So it's really no different than the presidency today when people are talking about Supreme Court judges and that being one of the most powerful things that a president can do in the long term. So, this stuff is still going on. And the other thing is that early on, 1801, one of Jefferson's campaign points was that he was going to reduce the size of the federal government. Now, the federal government was tiny at that time, but again, it's a reoccurring theme that goes on today, and I just think that it's interesting as we go back and read about this stuff that some of these issues remain the same and always have. So it's important because I think you hear a lot of people, especially on the news, saying, "Oh, it's never been this bad before," and it's always been like this to some extent. So what's happening is it's important to know that the French Revolution is going on at the end of the 1700s, and it has a profound impact on the United States. And we talked about the Alien and Sedition Acts, this fear that this radicalism that was born out of the French Revolution was going to happen here in the U.S. So a lot of people were following that. And in addition to that effect, the French Revolution also changed the way European powers would act towards each other. So if you know anything about French history, after the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte comes in and takes charge of France, and he's really an empire builder. So he starts to dominate Western Europe. This in turn rekindles war and tensions between Britain and France, and so that starts to shake out as far as the sea goes and merchants on the sea. And of course, the U.S. is shipping a lot of stuff to Europe at that time. So there's a lot of tension between France and Britain, and blockades and ships, blasting our ships out of the water. And, the way it turns out, France also has a problem down in the Caribbean. So what's Haiti now? There's a slave revolt in Haiti. Napoleon sends troops to try to defeat the slaves. He's unsuccessful, and he gets into a lot of war debt. And that's important because he had just acquired the Louisiana Territory, which is a huge tract of land, which is west of the Mississippi, all the way from the Gulf Coast, all the way up to the Canadian border, not all the way to the west. Take the Rocky Mountains as a loose border on the west, but it's a huge tract of land that France had bought from Spain, and now France is broke, and in 1803, Napoleon sells the Louisiana Territory to the U.S. government. Thomas Jefferson makes the deal for about 3.5 cents per acre. So it greatly expands the size of the U.S. In the meantime, We don't know what's out there. We don't know what's out in the West at all. Hard to imagine, but that's the case. So you've heard of the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804. Lewis and Clark, they leave St. Louis in May in boats. They sail up the Missouri River, and that's the big territorial exploration to find out what's out west. And some of you may know something about that. The astounding thing is, and it's hard for us to imagine because we're so used to quick transportation, but Lewis and Clark leave St. Louis in May of 1804, and they only make it to South Dakota by November, where they pack up for the winter the first time, and they build a fort called Fort Mandan in South Dakota. So again, along the way, Lewis and Clark learn a lot about the country. They meet Sacagawea, who's a Native American who helps them as a guide. And there's a whole story and a whole narrative about that, but we don't have time to get into it. So that's what's going on in the country at that time. Jefferson's in office. We've acquired all this land, and it's going to set us up for a real expansion out west. But in the meantime, what's happening is that Jefferson really kind of screws up because he gets into a spat with Britain, and Britain decides to cut us off and not ship us any more goods. Well, that's a disaster for our economy because we don't have any manufacturing at that time. So there's this embargo going on, and it's really something that marks a disastrous turn in the Jefferson presidency. All of a sudden, Britain cuts us off. So imagine, if China cut us off today, we couldn't get iPhones, or we couldn't get, we get everything from China. So that wouldn't be happening. Jefferson gets himself in this situation where England cuts off everything, and the economy goes into what we call a panic, which now we call those, recessions or depressions, but they were called panics back in the day. So Jefferson really screws up as far as the economy goes. The other thing that happens is kind of ironic. So with this embargo that Jefferson caused, manufacturing in the U.S. starts to grow because we're not getting manufactured goods from England anymore. And it's ironic because Jefferson was the kind of guy who didn't want to see us become a big manufacturing powerhouse. He thought that manufacturing and industrialization really kind of ruined society. He saw this country as a land of farmers and independent agriculturalists, but with the British embargo that Jefferson caused, manufacturing starts to grow. So it really started to turn us into an industrialized country. So that's going on in 1807. And James Madison takes office in 1809 and really starts to kind of tighten our relationship with France, but not with England at all. So we get into a spat with the British at sea. They block one of our ships leaving Norfolk. There's the spat over that. And the next thing you know, the War of 1812 starts, which is a war between England and the U.S. So, and I think you know about the War of 1812, but basically we totally screwed up in that war. We did not have an organized military to speak of. England had a huge navy. They were the dominant power on the globe at that time. We tried to invade Canada early on in the War of 1812. It was a disaster. In the meantime, the British are off the East Coast just hammering everything. They burnt down the White House. They burnt down the Treasury. They burnt down the Capitol. They proceeded to fire on Fort Baltimore. That's when Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. And so that's all going on. And the only thing that's really notable out of all of this is that Andrew Jackson, who's a young soldier at that time, goes to New Orleans and in 1814 defeats the British in the Battle of New Orleans. But again, there was already a treaty in place. Jackson just didn't know it. But the cool thing about Jackson's victory, or at least the significant thing, is it bred this nationalism because we beat the British and there was a reason to get behind the country. So it really, in some way, unified the country again, because anytime there's a victory, especially a military victory, the country comes together and there's this newfound nationalism. So that's what's going on. The War of 1812, the Battle for New Orleans, 1814, Andrew Jackson, and keep him in mind because we're going to read about the Jacksonian democracy in chapter 10, which is going to be coming up. In the meantime, we have the war is over. The 1812 war is over. We have the Louisiana Purchase, and the economy and the population continues to grow like crazy. So there's a lot of farmers now who are raising a lot of food, and we really don't have any transportation routes. So as necessity is the mother of invention, there's a move to building very crude overland trails, but canal building becomes the rage. Now, again, there's no cars, there's no trucks, there's no railroads, there's no transportation. So canals are sort of this first wave of this technological innovation transportation thing. And, Robert Fulton, builds the Claremont, which is the first steam engine. And so the steam engine really in the early 1800s, the 1810s, 1820s, the steam engine is really the internet of the day, because there's no self-propelled power. It's all horses and people. So the steam engine was amazing, and it was first applied to boats. And now all of a sudden a boat could go up the Hudson River all the way up to Erie. So you've heard of the Erie Canal. That was built at that time. So you can imagine a steamship, if you know your geography, leaving New York City and going up the Hudson River all the way to Erie, Pennsylvania, and the Erie Canal, in effect, connecting the Great Lakes to the Hudson. So now there was a great boom in Buffalo, New York, and Albany. Those cities continued to grow. And there were canals, of course. If you're from Northwest Ohio, where I'm at right now, there's canals all over this area. If you're familiar with the Maumee River and the Miami Canal, I think you know about most of those if you grew up around here or basically anywhere in Ohio. So canal building is sort of the interstate highway internet of the day, and what it does is it really expands the economy, it expands farming, there's this huge growth in population, and the steam engines on the big rivers, so steam engines on the Ohio River and the Mississippi River for the first time ever, really open up the West. So Cincinnati, for example, is really considered a Western town, and it is booming at this time because now there's transportation between Cincinnati and the east and all the way down to the south via the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. So at that time, Cincinnati becomes a major processing city. So one of the things that Cincinnati's really famous for at that time is it's sort of the meat packing capital of the country before Chicago was, because it was far west and it was on a major transportation route. And actually, evidence of that now, one of the interesting things, if you study technology or business, that the rendering of meats and fats leads to the manufacturing of soap. And it's one of the reasons that Procter & Gamble is in Cincinnati today, is because this big soap manufacturing industry was there, which I'm getting way off track, but I just want you to understand that technology and transportation starts to set the stage for industrialization, and these industrialized cities and the growth of cities towards the west, such as Buffalo, such as Cincinnati, really starts to be characteristic of how the economy is growing. At the same time, New England is starting to boom as a manufacturer of textiles. So prior to the embargo, the English embargo under Jefferson, we got all of our clothes and woolens from England, but because of that embargo, there was this great growth in manufacturing in New England, and New England became, the headquarters of most textile manufacturing. Now that's long gone, but in the early 1800s, it was really starting to boom. So that's going on. Religion is continuing to expand. We talked about the First Great Awakening. There's the Second Great Awakening underway, and the society is starting to grow culturally and it's starting to expand economically. So there's a lot in Chapter 9. We're going to talk about Jacksonian democracy in Chapter 10 coming up next. And we'll get into that, and we'll start to learn about Andrew Jackson and how he was sort of this person who was a lot different than anyone who'd come before him. Washington and Adams and Jefferson and Madison were all these, old school East Coast intellectuals, and Jackson now is a war hero after the Battle of New Orleans and is going to come in with a new populist message that is going to start to rally the rural parts of the country. So a lot to look forward to in the next chapters, chapter 10 and 11. That's it for now. Have a great day. See you later. Bye-bye.